All right, everybody, it's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcasts. There's a show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in 3 categories: education, storyteller and drama, and arts. For 5 years and with over 280 weekly episodes and 64 million plus downloads, the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast has provided advice and tips from international best-selling authors, world-class artists, contest judges and winners, and industry professionals. It is based on the world-famous Writers of the Future contest created in 1983 by L. Ron Hubbard to help the aspiring writer and artist no matter their age, race, ethnicity, or gender. It is dedicated to the future of storytelling and art by showing that it is never too late to start, and those who make it are those who never give up. We are all busy, but I'd be so grateful if you could take a moment and vote now. Go to podcastawards.com to nominate the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast in any or all 3 of the categories: education, storyteller drama, or art. News on the flip side. It's time for you to get out and nominate your favorite podcast. There's an amazing show I want you to consider for the People's Choice Podcast Awards. The News on the Flip Side, in the category of politics and news. News on the Flip Side is a much different news and political program, which is not deemed as opinion news. Listen as anchor host Joe Montaldo brings you just the facts from trusted sources, which will allow you, the people, to make up your own minds on the various stories being reported on. Go to podcastawards.com to nominate the News on the Flip Side in the category of news and politics. That's podcastawards.com. Please take a moment and vote now.
Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Writers of the Future is one of the longest running writing competitions in the world, now celebrating 4 decades of providing a helping hand as initially conceived by L. Ron Hubbard. I also want to let you know that the Writers of the Future volumes are available in bookstores throughout the U.S., Canada, the UK, South Africa, and Australia, as well as all throughout major online retailers around the world. I'm here today at the Writers and Illustrators of the Future workshop in Hollywood, where winners from year 40 are here to unhinge their jaws and open wide as that famous fire hose of information is shot down their throats. One such author, a veritable fire hydrant unto himself, is Orson Scott Card, called Scott by his friends. Orson Scott Card is the author of the novels Ender's Game, Ender's Shadow, and Speaker for the Dead, which are widely read by adults and younger readers. And also Ender's Game, when I interviewed Tom Doherty, said that's his best-selling science fiction book from Tor for all time. He has also written his series, the young adult Pathfinder series, Pathfinder, Ruins, Visitors, and the fantasy Myther Mages series, Lost Gate, Gate Thief, Gate Father, are taking readers in new directions. Besides these and other science fiction novels, Scott Card writes contemporary fantasy, Magic Street, which I got when that first came out. That's in our library at the office. Enchantment, Lost Boys, biblical novels, Stone Tables, Rachel and Leah, and American Frontier Fantasy series, The Tales of Alvin Maker, which is probably one of the most, other than his Ender's Game, is the next most popular series. He goes on and on, but if you know who Orson Scott Card is, you're probably not listening to this podcast anyway. So welcome, Scott.
It's good to be here.
So I'm going to take advantage of this, not having, say, okay, a lot of times I'll read a book a week to interview an author, and that's how I do that. But I've read so many of your books that I think the value to you, because you do the quarterly workshop Q&A, which is just a highlight for a lot of writers. And
it's a highlight for me, that's for sure.
which is great. So now that you're here at the Writers Workshop, I guess, first of all, a little bit about your journey, because one thing I find when I talk to icons of the industry, people think, oh, I could never be that person, and don't realize that everybody has a humble beginning. Can you please then, how your journey went from being mild-mannered?
I'm still mild-mannered.
Okay, let me rephrase that. How you got your start?
Yeah, my start actually was unintentional. I didn't dream of being a writer. I mean, that was sort of in my family, that everybody, we're Latter-day Saints, and in Mormon culture, there's a tradition of doing little 10-minute parody dramas or comedies called road shows, which used to be that we would take them on the road. That is, we'd go from one meeting house to another and put on the shows. But that tradition is sort of amateur playwriting, amateur musicals. And my parents had written some. They would talk about the ones they had done in the past. And so when I came of age, I started writing things like that too. School assembly, things. Writing was just something that we did. Cards, write, and that's fine. But it was not a career choice. I had planned to be in the military until I found out the Civil War was over. So all of my reading of the Civil War strategies was not going to help me a bit, and that I would have to become one of those soldiers who can actually run the obstacle course. And I realized, well, okay, that's not happening. And then there was a while that I was going to be a doctor until I realized that would imply that I had to actually study math and science, which were interesting to me, but not as a producer, but as a consumer of them. And so what happened is I got to university as a archaeology major, and I was at Brigham Young, and that archaeology there meant probably working in Mesoamerican or American, North American archaeology. And I discovered in the first 3 weeks that was not going to happen, that I was not interested enough in the things you have to know to be an archaeologist. Plus, I learned that I actually realized from all of my reading of what archaeologists had done, I recognized that I didn't want to do archaeology. I wanted to read about people doing it, because every part of doing it involved working somewhere in the blazing sun, and sweating a lot, or working in some musty basement trying to put 1,000 pot shards together to make one urn. And I realized, no, that's not what I can do. I don't have the patience for it. I don't have the stamina on one project to keep going and going and going. I need to have things end. I need to work on something and then be done.
Mm-hmm.
And that was not, I've learned that over the years that that's just how it has to be. That's why I don't make my bed in the morning, because I would just have to make it the next day anyway. So who cares? It's an eternal, endless process. But what happened, I was at university, and I was, I had already, I went to Brigham Young High School just for my last year of school. It was my junior year, but it was an individual progress school. So I finished my junior and senior year in 1 year, and I was done. And so I graduated at 16 from high school. And while I was there that year in high school, I went up on campus to try out for some student-directed shows. And while I'm not a brilliant actor by any stretch, I am a very good auditioner, meaning that I can take text that I've never read before and read meaning into it so that it doesn't sound like I'm reading. So I got cast. I wasn't good, but I got cast. And I did say the lines convincingly. The audio portion is what I do. But anyway, I realized when I was disillusioned with my possibilities in archaeology, I realized I'm spending every spare minute here in my freshman year at Brigham Young trying out for and being in plays. Why is that not my major? There were several excellent reasons. One is, how in the world are you supposed to make a living at it? Well, when it's acting, you're supposed to be very, very good and very, very lucky. I couldn't test the luck part, but I thought I can learn and become better. And, so I was involved in theater. I was trying out for shows, but I was also finding out that that the scripts had many flaws that they were doing and that I could fix them. And so I remember I was being the assistant director on a production of Flowers for Algernon, the basis of the movie Charlie. And I had read the story and the novel in my early teens. And I just hated the script because while it's one thing to write Charlie while he's retarded, when he gets this mental boost and you're writing him as an intelligent person who used to be retarded, it was not good. That second act, the second half, was not good. So I asked the director for permission to write a new version of it. He said, sure, give it a try. Of course, the contract with the publisher would never have allowed that. I did it anyway. I wrote it, and he liked it way better than the one that was written. So that's the one that was produced. And it worked pretty well. Now, the statute of limitations has passed, so I doubt that the publisher can now sue Brigham Young University for letting me write the second half of Flowers for Algernon. But I thought, I can do this. When I see that something doesn't work as a writer, I can fix it. And so I was doing some play doctoring and then realized, why am I just fixing other people's scripts? So I did some adaptations of books into Reader's Theater. I did a production of Tell Me That You Love Me, Junie Moon, a book that I didn't even at the time fully understand, but it didn't matter because I could take the good scenes, and I ended up with a Reader's Theater production, about an hour long, that played 2 nights. The second night, it was packed with people sitting all up and down the stairway of the experimental theater at BYU in the old Fine Arts Center. And it was a hit. I mean, people were sobbing at the end, but laughing all the way through in all the right places. And I'm thinking, I really can do this because, yes, it's Marjorie Kellogg's wonderful book. And I am just delivering that. But I did deliver it. I mean, I delivered it with all of its emotional impact. And I thought, okay, now I'm going to try original stuff. Well, my original stuff was all adaptations of history and so forth, too. But while I was at BYU as a student, I wrote and had produced about 20 plays, which is not bad.
For sure.
But I also learned things about dramatic structure. And most of all, I learned how to write a scene. And I learned how to actor-proof lines. Because in theater, the writer has power, unlike in Hollywood, where not a chance. So they don't fire you and rewrite your play. You decide what the play is. You create the script. And if you change it, then it's changed. The director simply takes the information that the lines will now be these and works with them. So what I learned was to attend rehearsals and not watch anything. Just listen. Because what I would find is that if there is a way to misinterpret a line so that it makes no sense whatsoever, actors will find that way. They think they're being creative and finding an offbeat way, and they're correct. It's offbeat, but it's also off script. It's not how it's supposed to be. So then I would rewrite the line until it could not be read wrong. That's hard. But I got this great school of sitting there listening to actors saying my lines and realizing it's not working. And sometimes I would take a scene that ran for 10 minutes on stage and distill it down to 2 minutes, and nothing was missing that needed to be there. Other times I would realize that something that happened off stage needed to be a scene, and I had been ducking the hard thing. Writers often do that. We know there's an obligatory scene that is hard to write, so we tend to want to skip it and then flash back to it later. which is anathema. You just don't do that
Right.
as a writer. So I began to be able to write the through line of presenting to an audience on a bare stage, my favorite way to work. I don't like working with sets and stuff because then there's only one thing that it can be. Whereas when it's an abstract set, it can be many things in the eyes of
That's right.
the audience. I learned how to structure a play so that you could feel the ending, that the ending felt like closure. And I learned how to handle the opening so that the expository flow made sense, so that the audience would start knowing nothing. And the dialogue in the first scene would reveal enough information without the embarrassing scene between the servants going, well, as you know, our master so-and-so, it's not that's not a good way to do it, but to handle exposition through the dialogue, through the scenes, through what people say, and yet have each scene still have its own rising and falling action and its own tension. So I didn't become a brilliant playwright. I became an adequate playwright. But in Mormon culture, to have somebody writing plays, adequate plays about our scripture, our people, our history, our present day circumstances, made me a successful, not financially, a successful playwright in the Wasatch Front of Utah. And I wasn't the only one by any means. There were some who wrote more successful plays, some of which I did not like at all. So, I always had that wonderful competitive thing of thinking, is that what everybody wants? Is that the one that they're all going to come to? But then again, people don't usually go to plays. And but at that time, we did get large audiences for our plays. And while I was a missionary for the Mormon Church, I wrote a play about Moses called Stone Tables. You mentioned the title. I turned it into a novel many years later, but while I was gone, while I was in Brazil, it got put on at BYU and was a smash hit. It was held over for a couple of weeks, which doesn't happen in academic theater because there was so much demand for tickets. And I was thrilled to hear about that, but I never saw that production.
Wow.
I heard it. They made a tape, and I knew the actors because it was all my friends from before my mission. So, but it was a good production directed by the faculty member who had most sponsored me as a writer, which was really helpful because he was also the best director on the faculty. So I was now a playwright. I remember on a different faculty member, I was riding on the elevator with him, and he said, well, so Card, you're going to be a writer. And I said, no, I am a writer. I'd written 20 plays, for heaven's sake. How was I not yet a writer? Just because I wasn't getting paid for it didn't mean anything. I was writing plays that were getting produced. Actors were saying my lines. So I said that to him, not to be offensive or even to be offended, just to say, no, you misunderstood. What I'm doing right now is real. And he sort of forced me to realize that. Later, I happened to walk in on his teaching of a very large introduction to theater course. And he saw me walk in at the top of the theater, very steep theater. And so he knew that I was there when he said, so many of you are going to end up being in theater, doing many different jobs, except for Orson Scott Card, who already is a writer. He hated that. He hated that. Because in a way, I was denying the efficacy of what the faculty did.
Yeah. Is that room? Because I was a guest instructor at BYU when Brandon was teaching, and it was like
just a steeply raked.
Yeah, steeply raked. And then he had a stage at the bottom where he was he would instruct from, and there was a chalkboard or a whiteboard or something behind him.
Now, there's also a lecture hall, a recital theater that also describes. And the whiteboard suggests it was the lecture theater.
Okay.
Because the experimental theater had a stage with a lift, and we were talking about a major stage setup. It was smallish, but very conducive to intimate plays. And so that was all I was planning to do, except I thought, well, I ought to try at least a couple of writing courses. I had never taken an English course at the university because I tested out at freshman comp. I was a better writer than I needed to be, and I understood grammar really well. Mm-hmm. So there was nothing that they felt they needed to teach me. So I tested out of freshman comp, and then never took a literature course, but I started taking some writing courses and trying to write prose. And I remember one experience. Richard Craycroft was my teacher, wonderful teacher, good man, became a friend later. But I wrote a story and he gave it a C. I don't get C's. I was still very proud of the fact that I if they abolished the post of valedictorian the last year because I was going to be it, because the school was going to be closed. And I was an interloper who had just moved in that year and had not gone through 12 years of Brigham Young High School or Brigham Young Academy. And so I missed out on being valedictorian because, not malice, just they wanted to have one of their own, and I wasn't, which is fine,
Sure.
But I knew that I knew what I was doing academically, and I knew that my story did not deserve a mere C. But there's no point arguing grades on a subjective matter like the quality
Sure.
of a story. But one of the things he did in class was make us read our stories aloud. So he had read it, he had graded it, and then I stood at a lectern in the classroom, regular flat classroom, and read my story aloud. And he changed the grade to an A without my asking. And his explanation was, I didn't know how to read it until you read it to me. And that was the beginning of my faith in audiobooks. By the way, I think that that's the best way to experience literature, with a good reader.
Mm-hmm.
I realized that what was missing was somehow I needed to give the solo silent reader the experience of the play that I was writing. Because I realized that my fiction, when I tried it, was really a play with viewpoint brought in to serve the function that stage directions serve.
Right.
So I was still a playwright, and I thought, and it works. He changed my grade to an A because it works.
Mm-hmm.
So then I began to write other fiction, and I was practical. I thought, if I'm going to write fiction, I should write something that might make some money. And at the time, the short fiction market was some really well-paying ones like Redbook and Playboy and so forth. But I would be competing with John Updike, or, I didn't think I was going to do that. And I didn't like that kind of fiction. I didn't like Updike's writing. So if that's what they wanted, I didn't belong there.
Right.
But I read quite a bit of science fiction. I had not read it that much as a child, but I read the standard Heinlein juveniles and so forth. And I realized science fiction has current magazines that pay enough money to be noticeable. And so if I sell to one of them, I'll get a few $100. And that's more than I'd ever gotten from writing plays. So I started to write science fiction stories. And my earliest ones were the stories that are now collected into the book called The Worthing Saga. And my mom used to call them the stories about the blue-eyed people. And that was an accurate description, but not the one I thought was dignified enough. But my mom would type my manuscripts for me because she'd done that for me as a playwright. I would write the plays by sitting there with a spiral notebook on the steps of one or another of the entrances of the Harris Fine Arts Center at BYU, and write scenes in pen or pencil while I was waiting for my dad to come pick me up because I didn't have a driver's license. I didn't get one until I was 23, I believe. So I my stuff was all in my longhand. I tried to make it legible, and my mother, the gifted, brilliant woman that she was able to decipher almost every word I wrote, and then I could fill in the bad one. Sometimes there was a word that baffled even me, and I had no idea what I had put there.
My mom used to say she loved when I wrote letters to her from college, because she could read them over and over, and every time she gets something new out of it.
Yeah, well,
because of my penmanship.
Yeah, now that's funny. But my penmanship now, of course, I'm old and my hands tremble a little, which is the thing that seems to have ended Shakespeare's career, is trembling hands, so that he could collaborate with somebody but not be the sole writer, because he could not write a steady hand that other people could read. And so now, if I had to write in longhand, song lyrics I can do, poems, hymns I can write, but anything long, just too hard for anybody to read. But my mom could type my plays. And so when I started writing short stories, I would type them. I would write on the typewriter because I was a good, fast typist, but nothing compared to my mother, who was 120 word per minute with no errors typist.
Wow.
She, this was in the days when if you were typing, you could stop, roll the thing up, use whiteout or liquid paper, and type the thing over again, that part. But she said, that's a waste of time to roll it out, then try to line it back up again and all that. She would just, if she made a typo in the last letter at the bottom of the page, she'd just pull the page out and retype the whole page because it was faster than making a correction. She was that
Wow.
good. And that very rarely happened because I would proofread dissertations that she would type for doctoral candidates at Arizona State University. We were living in Mesa at the time. And I was a good proofreader. I found that I enjoyed doing it. I could spot errors.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to compare the original with what she wrote because she was always dead on. So all I was looking for was a typo that had slipped past her. And so I did a good job. I earned a little money from her doing that. And that was the beginning, by the way, of my paying career as an editor and proofreader. But she would type for me. But I was getting faster and faster as a typist. And I began to have access to electric typewriters.
Mm-hmm.
And while I was on my mission in Brazil, I wrote the Playstone tables on a typewriter in the mission office in Sao Paulo. And so I was still a playwright in my heart, but I also had this desire to be a science fiction writer. Now, see, when I was my 16th birthday, which was my first birthday living in Utah. It was, anyway, it doesn't matter. On my 16th birthday, my older brother and his girlfriend, who is now his wife and continues to be, got me 2 books that seemed to be a complete set, Foundation and Second Foundation, because they had no idea that Second Foundation was the 3rd book. So when I got to the 2nd book, it was baffling. Who is this mule guy that they're talking about? But it was Asimov. You can't find it. I'd read a lot of Heinlein and so forth, not much Asimov at all, but the clearest writer ever to write English in America. And it was a good school to go to, even when I didn't realize I was going to school,
Mm-hmm.
because he was able to establish characters and draw them well without describing them or stopping and giving the backstory. And so after reading the trilogy, Foundation trilogy, I thought, I wonder if I could write something like that. Now, at that point, I had already tried writing some science fiction stories, but this was hard SF. This was the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something I had tried. I'd been writing more like Zena Henderson up to that point. And so I remember making that decision at the beginning of my ride to BYU as my dad was taking me. By the time we got through the river bottoms in Utah Valley and up to the university, I had come up with the idea of how would you train people for war in space to get them to think in 3 dimensions? So I invented the whole idea of the battle school, of a place where you, without drifting off into space, could still practice orienting yourself in 3D, null gravity space. It was a good premise. It wasn't a story yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept that at the back of my mind as this